It's so hard to hear this without thinking about the death of God in the Nietzschean sense in modern times, and this lack of trust in the priest class. Dr. Benner is about to lose her mind.
The priest class is sacrificing people, and they're sacrificing the people that live on the periphery of town. What you said right now, which is that you don't see the periphery burning, but you do see the temple complexes burning, to me indicates an anger towards that specific practice. And I don't think the upper middle, I mean, I'm not sure about this, but I don't think that the upper middle class is the one that's being collected for sacrifice. They're not disposable in the same, maybe I'm totally wrong, but it seems to me like that wouldn't be who you would pull from, because it's hard for me to believe that there isn't a very human desire for self-preservation.
Like, you want the doctors and lawyers, basically.
Not even just the doctors and lawyers, but some, which you do, but you also,
Engineers.
if you are a doctor or lawyer, you're able to be like, I don't know that I want Johnny to be sacrificed. Yes, I'm sure it's very honorable for the gods, but I like Johnny, or whatever, right? And so it's like,
I mean, unfortunately, it seems more complicated. So I will say that the sacrifices, probably a majority of them are from outside of the city. They're not from within the city. They were captured, they were acquired in some way through military conquest. Although there are a good number who were from the city or lived in the city. We get some, in terms of class, there's some, complex issues. So in one example, in one of the moon pyramid sacrifices that has 3 individuals, 2 of them seem to be Maya dignitaries wearing really fancy jade and all decked out. And so that's something different was happening there. We know that Teotihuacan had this sort of incursion, a military incursion, or some segment of Teotihuacanos into the Maya region, where previously there seems to have been diplomatic relations. Those soured at some point in the late 4th century, and that might be a result of this particular sacrifice. But then, one other thing I would say is that the practice doesn't go away. In fact, if anything, it accelerates after Teotihuacan. So sacrifice in the Toltec or Aztec system continues to be a way of paying a blood debt and keeping the world going.
And like forging an identity that's distinct from the outside world, right? It's like the whole purpose of culture is to make you part of the in-group as opposed to something chaotic that's out there that's different from you. And it seems like what better way to accomplish that than to take something from the outside world and claim, like a human being from the outside world, and claim power over them as a civilization and stage these events. Like they just, it's hard to imagine anything else that would unite people better together. I mean, people do it with war today, right? We'll go as a civilization and attack a country just because we can, because we're so powerful. And it's quite interesting how that seems to be a real necessity for gluing a civilization together.
Mm-hmm.
It also strikes me that the people who won the conflict, or the inheritors of the social strife, must have been the ones that were pro-sacrifice. Right, so that whoever remained after a period of burning and destruction.
Do you think that it was really a top-down thing, or was it people really want, like people love sports, for instance, people love blood sports, people love war, like people love beating other people.
Why would you burn the temple complexes where the sacrifices are, like people don't burn the stadiums, right? Like if you love football, you don't burn down the stadium. You hooligan and you burn the buses outside of the stadium because you're like. I
wouldn't think this so much in sports. So so right now we are we just passed Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead in Mexico, right? And I've seen some altars. We had a memorial for a dear colleague who lost this summer. I would think differently about ideologies of life and death, and that are part of the longue durée of Mexican history, and sort of the reciprocal relationship between life and death, and that death gives new life, and ideas like having a glorious death, which could happen through sacrifice or dying on the battlefield, or for women dying in childbirth. You would be reincarnated as a butterfly that's sipping nectar from the flowers in the next world. A colleague recently has sort of, some people have made claims that some of this ideology could come from the great migration of monarch butterflies into the region, that happens right around this time. So, this massive, and the North was the place of the dead within Mesoamerican belief system. So to see all these returning butterflies around now seems connected to this ideology. When we see visions of like what Pedro kind of saw as a paradise, it's butterflies and flowers and birds and these are also the souls of people who died valiantly feeding the sun or keeping the world going. So it's a really different way than we've come to think of it in the Western world. And I usually think it needs to be part and parcel with any discussion about warfare. So when we think about Mesoamerican warfare, was literally fought with sticks and stones. And I don't mean to like say that in a way that's disparaging technologically, but there's no metal weapons, really of any consequence. There's some use in West Mexico. There's no cavalry. There's no major naval power. The ability to kill lots of people was underdeveloped in certain ways in Mesoamerica compared to warfare in Eurasia, where there was this ramping up of technology, like we talked about at the beginning of the hour, with developing bronze weapons and then iron weapons and chariots and fortifications and naval battle. And so some of the ideology that we would call quote unquote tribal or earlier primitive ideology of life and death and how to treat the dead still was there in Mesoamerican warfare, where there was just the inability to kill that many people on the battlefield. And so the objective was often to subdue the enemy and actually conquer an area, but also to take captives back for sacrifice. And you can't divorce just the practice of sacrifice or treating the dead from this whole religious system and this socio-technological system of warfare.
I don't think that you can get rid of that need in civilization. I wonder if
For blood sport?
for sacrifice, for violence as a unifying feature of a civilization. I mean, this will be the ultimate test of whether we can make it off this planet, I think, is whether we can get past that, because we really seem to need to other people in order to solidify our own culture. And it seems like you can trace this back through, I mean, come on, the Mesoamericans weren't the only people sacrificing people. Obviously, like the ancient Canaanite civilizations were famous for this. There's you see it in what we'd call the indigenous civilization populations all throughout the world, even up to the present. It's not a particularly unique idea to ritually sacrifice your enemies in a way that is a party. Essentially, you're rallying around this as a civilization. It really glues everything together.
What's interesting is that I've read that the collapse of Teotihuacan is maybe linked to a climactic event that happened in like 580, I think it was, where there was volcanism that prevented agriculture from being as effective. And so if you have this sacrificial practice that is meant to gather people and to ensure the survival of the civilization, and you have a storm god that is supposed to be protecting you, and all of a sudden it stops working, then you have, like you said earlier, the death of God, and then things shake apart because people don't trust in the ritual anymore. Does that have any truth to it?
I think it could be true, but that volcanism is not quite yet established enough for me. The volcanism that I think is very solid is what starts Teotihuacan, what makes it a big place. So the fact that Popocatépetl, the really big volcano over Mexico City, erupted sometime around 2,000 years ago. The exact dating is disputed, but let's say, give or take 50 years on either side. It was a huge eruption. A volcanologist would call it a VEI-6 eruption, which for comparison, when Krakatoa, the volcano in Indonesia, erupted in the late 19th century, could be heard in Australia. That was a VEI-6 eruption. And so that is really well documented by volcanologists and geoarchaeologists, and the impacts it had in making people migrate from the southern basin of Mexico and southern Puebla, both up to Teotihuacan and to another classic period city to the east called Cholula, that eventually made a bigger pyramid than any at Teotihuacan. And so the start of Teotihuacan as a cataclysmic event that precipitated migration to it, I think is very well established. Now, for
And
the
it seems like climate change could totally undermine your trust in a priest class that was supposed to be mediating the dispute with the gods as well.
Yeah, like whether or not it was volcanism, is it accepted that there was some kind of change in agricultural success at that point?
Not consensus, but there is some, like there are some precipitation proxies that suggest there was a period of drought around there. Now, the Teotihuacan had weathered other periods of drought before that, so I would say it's got to be some combination between, there's ecological crisis, but there's not the social resiliency, the social plasticity to rise to the occasion and move on, right? So that seems to have been lacking in the 6th century, but they had weathered other crises previously. So that I always see it as a connection between the social response, the potential for social resiliency, and any sort of ecological or social crisis.
And do you have a sense for what could have caused the social resiliency to decline?